And I see that people are still coming in at a good clip, but I'm going to get us started just so that we can stay within the hour. So thank you for joining. If you'd like that closed captioning, again, there's an icon on the bottom. I'm Jake Roach, Senior Outreach Coordinator for the Global Security Program at Union of Concerned Scientists. I work with UCS members to advocate for nuclear weapons policy, and I hope that many of you will decide to take action after this event, urging your members of Congress to do all they can to avoid a new Cold War with China. I'll put a link to the action in the chat later on in the webinar, and also look for an action link in our follow-up email. So that follow-up email will also have a link to a recording of this event. A lot of people have emailed asking if there'll be a recording. That should be going out around Monday afternoon. And like I said, speaking of recording, we're already recording and streaming live. So if you don't want to be on camera, you can turn that off now. And we're so pleased to have UCS President Joanna Chow Krylak kicking off the program this evening. Quick intro for Joanna. She joined UCS bringing her 3 decades of experience with social movements, science policy, and working to combat climate change. She served on the executive team of the Open Society Foundations, where she established and led the Foundation's strategy unit responsible for planning, research, and assessment for the Foundation's 50 global programs, national foundations, and advocacy offices. While at Open Society, she also founded the $43 million Climate Action Initiative. The U.S. component includes support for nonpartisan public mobilization and policy advocacy at city, state, regional, and federal levels, as well as shareholder advocacy and litigation aimed at corporate polluters. Prior to joining Open Society in 2013, Ms. Krylak created and led a Justice and Human Rights program at the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations at Harvard University. She previously launched and led an economic justice grant-making program at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, supporting informal workers' movements globally, and organized within the Asian and Pacific Islander immigrant community to advance rights-respecting economic and health policy. Joanna is also a trained mediator and facilitator and serves on numerous nonprofit boards. She earned a BA with distinction in anthropology from Stanford University and an MPA from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. So with that, Joanna, thanks so much. Take us away.
Thank you so much, Jake, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to each of you for joining us tonight. I am really honored to be kicking off our program this evening, and so pleased that you've chosen to spend this next hour with us discussing a science-based perspective on how the United States can avoid a new Cold War with China. Relationships between the United States and China are literally woven into my DNA, and the role of science has also been central to my story. My grandfather, Dr. Edward Chow, was born in Suzhou, China in 1919. As a brilliant geologist, he was recruited to join the U.S. government as a scientist with the United States Geological Survey. Over the course of his 43-year career with this federal agency, my grandfather was at the forefront of discoveries in impact geology, which is essentially what happens to minerals when meteors crash into the Earth's surface. His work helped create and shape whole fields of industry and landed him as a principal investigator for NASA on the Apollo project, where he designed the United States' first lunar sampling program and helped send Neil Armstrong to the moon. I can still remember spending time with him in his basement office in the Arlington, Virginia suburbs and marveling at his meticulously labeled mineral samples that he'd collected from all around the world, from Arizona to Inner Mongolia. And if he hadn't accepted that job at the Geological Survey and raised his family in the United States, his life and mine would look very different. I'm so proud to continue his science-based legacy at the helm of an organization that is so dedicated to creating opportunities for diplomacy and cross-cultural collaboration through a shared appreciation for science. It is important to know, however, that my grandfather's experience as a lead scientist in the U.S. government was not simply about the joy and satisfaction of scientific discovery. Throughout his career, he experienced persistent racism and xenophobia, which impacted him and all of his relationships. My grandfather's experience as a Chinese American scientist was not and is not an isolated experience. And I could share many examples of how racism and xenophobia persists in our culture, politics, and U.S. foreign policy, in our relationship with China, with people of Chinese and wider Asian descent here in the United States. At the Union of Concerned Scientists, however, we are seizing every chance that we have to shift oppressive assumptions for the love of science, for the potential created by cross-cultural collaboration, and frankly, to keep the peace. The war in Ukraine and Putin's threats to deploy nuclear weapons may be giving some of us flashbacks to the Cold War, but our geopolitical landscape has changed dramatically since then, especially with China having become a powerful and influential world leader. We need to find new ways to live and cooperate with each other that aren't reliant on building ever more destructive weapons. Our goal at UCS is to ease tensions, to slow, stall, and end dangerous arms races. And of course, change starts at home. Among our priorities at the Union of Concerned Scientists are also cleaning up our own house and setting the right example by advocating to improve outdated and dangerous US policies around nuclear weapons. In China, my wonderful colleague, Dr. Gregory Kulacki, is working on cultivating these precious cross-cultural relationships, and he's been doing this for decades, in service of a better understanding between our two countries and with the ultimate goal of arms control. He will speak to us about some of the initiatives we have in the works and the philosophy behind them. And for those of you who have not had the pleasure of being introduced to Gregory or to hear him speak, he is UCS's China project manager with our organization. For over 20 years, he's promoted dialogue between experts from the US and Chinese contingency on nuclear arms control and space security. He's consulted with Chinese and US governmental and non-governmental organizations, including the US House-China Working Group, the Senate Armed Services Committee, the US National Academies, NASA, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Gregory has lived and worked in China for more than 20 years, and we are so lucky to have Gregory on staff and with us this evening. With that, I will turn the program over to him.
Well, thank you, Joanna, for that very generous introduction. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully this will all work as it's supposed to. Are we good?
We're good.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us. I thought I should start by saying just a little bit about my personal connection to China and how that informs my perception of U.S.-China relations. I first went to China in 1984 through an exchange program established by Fudan University and the University of Maryland, where I was a graduate student. During that initial 2-year experience, I discovered there was a significant difference between the China I learned about in the United States and the China I encountered while living there. And in one way or another, I've spent most of my professional life trying to reconcile that difference. I returned to China in 1989 to direct U.S. educational programs at Chinese universities for the U.S.-based Council on International Educational Exchange. And I worked for the council for 10 years while building a life in China. And I came to the Union of Concerned Scientists in 2002. And until the pandemic, I continued to spend several months every year working in China. And my primary task, as it was in my previous job, is to facilitate more effective cross-cultural communication between Chinese and Americans. Of course, the major difference is that instead of talking about education, our conversations are about nuclear weapons, missile defenses, the weaponization of outer space, and general problems in U.S. China relations. Now, those conversations were relatively easy to arrange and generally productive. For the first 10 years, I worked for UCS, but then things began to change. U.S.-China relations became contentious during the Obama administration, especially after the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009. And they deteriorated rapidly during the Trump administration. And today, after a decade of increasingly acrimonious relations, there's a strong bipartisan consensus that China is competing with the United States, as President Biden likes to put it, to, quote, win the 21st century, end quote. Now, science and technology are the central focus of this imagined competition. US officials believe Chinese leaders intend to use scientific discovery and new technologies to strengthen their authoritarian form of government, to impose it on other countries, and to change international institutions. US-China policy aims to exclude Chinese technology from the US and other world markets, to deny China access to advanced scientific research and cutting-edge technologies, and to isolate China economically and diplomatically. Now, left unchecked, these policies could create a world divided, as it was during the Cold War. And while this division may not be as rigid or as easily defined as it was in the 1950s, it could, as it did in the past, lead to crises and conflict and war. The Biden administration is already urging Congress to spend more money to prepare for a major war with China. And US diplomats are encouraging allies, especially Japan, and the member states of NATO to do the same. US defense experts are pushing for new nuclear capabilities that they imagine will increase the credibility of US threats to use nuclear weapons in a future military conflict with China. Now, to respond effectively to these developments, we need to understand why this is happening. And the most likely reason is a change in US perceptions of China. Now, beginning in the mid-1980s, US academic, economic, and political elites began to assume that China's communist system would peacefully evolve. A more open Chinese economy and society was supposed to create a more transparent and democratic Chinese politics. And oddly, those assumptions grew even stronger after Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping used lethal, brutal military force to suppress nationwide political protests in the spring of 1989. Deng said that that violent repression of those protests was necessary to stop what he and other Chinese communist leaders saw as an intentional US effort to undermine China and overthrow their government. Nevertheless, US economic elites and their many supporters in Congress and the executive branch continued to relax trade barriers, to permit technology transfers, and to lobby for China's admission to the World Trade Organization. Scientific, cultural, and educational exchanges, like the ones that took me to China, accompanied this increase in trade. Now, U.S. China trade and cultural exchanges helped sustain decades of uninterrupted double-digit annual economic growth, which transformed China's economy and Chinese society. But there were no signs of meaningful political change. The Chinese Communist Party's repressive methods of governing, including control over the media, the arts, Chinese academics, remained fundamentally unchanged. Now, while China's economy grew from a very low base, per capita income, and with it the average Chinese person's standard of living, is still, despite all those decades of growth, well lower, much lower than their counterparts in developed nations like the United States. And the gap between rich and poor grew uncomfortably wide for some Chinese policymakers. And many Chinese complained about corruption and suspected party officials used their political authority to enrich themselves and/or their families. And some left-leaning Chinese communist theorists connected corruption to foreign influence on China's economy and Chinese political culture. Now, the financial crisis of 2008 gave these left-leaning theorists a newfound credibility. And that shifted the Chinese Communist Party's thinking about the future of Chinese economic policy. The party leadership began to take steps to make China's economy less vulnerable to the potential mistakes of what the new Chinese leftists believed were corrupt, incompetent, and irresponsible U.S. leaders. And in 2012, the party Central Committee selected Xi Jinping, who was a dark horse candidate and who is the first leader of the People's Republic of China to be selected by his peers, as opposed to an elder leader. And they selected Xi based on his promises to clean up corruption and to redress the inequities in China's economy. Now, after that, Chinese economic elites with close ties to the United States fell out of favor. And when that happened, US elites lost valuable contacts, valuable sources of information about what was happening inside China. US economic elites began to worry about this shift in Chinese economic policy and its uncertain implications. And US political elites found Xi Jinping and this new cadre of Chinese officials surrounding him unfamiliar and less accommodating. And they began to believe that Xi was dangerously different than his recent predecessors and more like the Chinese revolutionary leader, Mao Zedong. Finally, while human rights have always been a problem in communist China, Xi's approach to maintaining what they say maintain social and political stability is far more repressive than his immediate predecessors. The mass internment and re-education camps in Xinjiang, which many very well-informed observers characterize as an instrument of cultural genocide, are especially troubling. So today there is very little interest within either government in communicating or cooperating with the other. Moreover, both governments are fomenting hostilities at home. U.S. politicians believe that acting tough on China can help them win elections. And the Chinese political leaders are using anti-American rhetoric to bolster their own political legitimacy. Diatribe is replacing dialogue, and demonstrations of resolve are replacing diplomacy. Now, this unfortunate pattern of interaction is very reminiscent of elite behavior during the Cold War era. And the cost of letting it continue could be very high. One very costly and dangerous development is the increasing preparations for nuclear war. China is constructing hundreds of new nuclear missile silos, presumably to increase the credibility of its threat to retaliate if the United States should use nuclear weapons first. And US military officials and politicians and analysts are using the new Chinese silos as a justification for continuing with plans to spend an estimated $1.5 trillion upgrading all three legs of the US nuclear triad of land, air, and sea-based nuclear missiles. Now, unless there's a concerted effort to stop it, this kind of back and forth could go on for decades. Enormous sums of money could be wasted on a contest of wills neither side can win. And the risk nuclear weapons might actually be used by design, miscalculation, or accident will increase. Now, based on decades of constructive conversations with our Chinese counterparts in the Chinese nuclear weapons laboratories and in the Chinese military, UCS believes this new nuclear arms race can be avoided. But it's going to prove extremely difficult without reducing the perceived need to prepare for a major war between the United States and China. Now, the principal driver of US-Chinese preparations for war is the dispute over Taiwan. US officials assume that Xi Jinping intends to seize the island by force as soon as he believes a military victory is possible. And Chinese officials assume that their US counterparts are intentionally encouraging the people of Taiwan to declare independence to provoke a crisis that would weaken China. And the poor people of Taiwan are caught in the middle of a fight that's none of their choosing or their creating, and they're just hoping to retain their autonomy while avoiding a war in which they are going to be the ones who suffer the most. Now, the United States and China are already engaged in a battle of military signaling and exercises to demonstrate resolve. Accidents have happened in the past, and the more tensions increase in the future, the more likely it is that the next accident, and there will be a next accident, could set off a chain of responses that leads to war between the two nuclear-armed states. And Taiwan is not the only potential trigger of a military conflict. Military posturing associated with Chinese territorial disputes with Japan, or one of China's many neighbors in the South China Sea, or a crisis on the Korean Peninsula could also open a path to general war. U.S. politicians from both parties justify accepting these risks with the highly questionable presumption that there are historical laws that determine the behavior of nations, and that the United States and China are destined, because of these laws, to engage in a zero-sum competition for global supremacy. Now, like domino theory during the Cold War, this kind of thinking could lead to decades of misinformed decisions that create crises and conflict and lead to war. Now, I'd like to wrap up and open the discussion with some suggestions about what we can do to help avoid a new Cold War with China. I think the most important thing we can do is to stop thinking that this zero-sum competition with China is inevitable, and to stop thinking that preparing for it is in our best interest. It's not. We need to warn our elected representatives of the dangers and let them know we cannot afford to foot the bill for another Cold War. Now, getting those messages across through social and traditional media and in public discussions, and even our personal conversations about China can, when added together, make a difference in the way the United States government thinks about U.S. China relations. And it's very important to realize we do not need to wait for our respective governments to alter the course of U.S. China relations. We can begin to do that ourselves through non-governmental educational, cultural, and scientific exchanges. They open lines of communication, they help establish mutual trust, and they create opportunities for positive change. The cross-cultural community that we can build through non-governmental exchanges can, as it did in the past, push U.S. decision makers to think differently about how they can not only avoid the worst outcomes, but advance policies that help the United States and China peacefully, fairly, effectively solve common problems and achieve common goals. Now, I recognize that it's more difficult now, both politically and morally, to build these kinds of cross-cultural relationships, given what's happening both within our governments and between them. But I believe the costs of letting things continue to deteriorate are just too high. And the potential benefits of those relationships are too important not to try. And with that, I'd like to open things up for discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Gregory. If anybody has questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Also, Gregory mentioned taking action. I'm just going to boost since I do outreach. If you want to take an action, there's a link there in the chat that you can save for later. Gregory, I wanted to start off. So I just want to thank everyone that ahead of time submitted over 150 questions. So we obviously won't be able to get to all of those in the next 27 minutes, but we'll try to cover some ground. You mentioned there that it was not only politically, but morally difficult to engage Chinese under the current circumstances. We received a lot of questions and expressions of concern about the human rights situation in China. Is this the source of moral difficulty?
Yes, it is. We just have to be so much more careful about who we engage. And we don't want to be engaging people that are directly involved in the commission of human rights abuses, or commission of crimes against humanity. There's still plenty of room for engagement with people in China, but that space is smaller and more difficult to navigate than it was in the past. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken made a point in his speech on China that there's to distinguish between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that's important. And I think if we do that carefully, that space is still there. But we have to be so much more careful. In a way, we've moved back in time to a China that thinks a little bit like it did in the 1970s. Especially about controlling what its own people think and do. And so our interactions with the Chinese, we have to be much more careful than we have been in recent decades. And especially for the people we're interacting with over there. It's a much greater risk for them to interact with us. They're taking more of a risk than they had to in the past. And we need to keep that into consideration as well. So it is just much more, it's a much more difficult situation to navigate than it was, when I was in China.
Thank you. Yeah, we also got a question that I wanted to bring up towards the beginning. Haven't we best discussed the proposal of a Cold War between the U.S. and China in an equitable and informed way without spreading anti-Asian rhetoric, which has increased since the pandemic?
I think the reason that you have this anti-Asian rhetoric is because there's a perception that the entire country and everyone in it and everyone associated with it is our enemy. And they are our enemy because we're in this historical clash of civilizations, and one side has to win and the other side has to lose. And that every gain they make is a loss for us. I think that's where that comes from. And so that's why we really need to get rid of this context of talking about the United States and China as if we're in some sort of historically determined competition for global supremacy. As long as that idea is perpetuated, the anti-Asian element is going to remain prominent in our conversations about China. It was in the recent legislation that they wanted to pass, was called competitiveness legislation originally. And there were many provisions in there which would have put McCarthy-esque kinds of programs in place where people would have been monitored and criticized for their normal activities, and Chinese Americans and Asian Americans would have borne the brunt of that kind of government intervention and oversight. So this idea that we're involved in this life and death struggle with China for survival is really, we have to get rid of that. We have to downplay that. And so when we talk about the many problems and differences between the United States and China, we just have to avoid talking in that context. And I think that'll make a big difference.
Agreed. Yeah, I as you're speaking on that, I think of that used to be how it was during the original Cold War. The way that Russians were always portrayed, and that sort of endless competition, to boost and to make the Cold War what it was. Actually, that leads to another question that came up in the chat here. If asked, is Taiwan a part of China? What is the current U.S. public position? I also wanted to throw in with that, the way that things went with Russia and Ukraine, we got a lot of questions comparing, is there a comparison there with Taiwan and China? And of course, with President Biden's statements as of late, I thought I'd just open that up for you, Gregory.
Wow. Well, that's a complicated question, and a very, the whole question of Taiwan's history and status is so controversial. I think the most important thing to say at the outset is the poor people of Taiwan have had no say in any of it. They've been bounced around between the Japanese, the Chinese, and the United States. The roots of the current problem go back to 1895, actually, when the Japanese Empire forced Qing Dynasty China to cede Taiwan to Japan. And Japan controlled the island until the end of World War II. Now, the United States got involved in 1943, President Roosevelt wanted the Republic of China to be sort of the major power post end of the Second World War and to sort of establish peace and stability in Asia. And so he agreed at the Cairo Conference in 1943 that all of the territories that Japan took from China would be returned, including Taiwan, and that was included in the treaties that were enacted at the time of Japan's surrender in World War II, and that's what happened. Control of Taiwan was turned over to the government of the Republic of China. Nobody asked the people in Taiwan, and there were an awful lot of Americans and other people who felt that that was wrong, and that Taiwan should have been allowed to have some sort of autonomy and determine its own, to exercise its right to self-determination, which was part of an important part of the UN Charter. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. When the Republic of China took it over in 1945, they mismanaged it, they looted it, they took everything valuable from it and took it back to the mainland. The Republic of China government was, under Chiang Kai-shek, was not particularly effective government, which is probably why they lost the Civil War to the Chinese Communists. And when that happened in 1949, they fled to Taiwan to escape being totally and completely defeated by the Chinese Communists. And that's why the official country name of Taiwan is not Taiwan, it's the Republic of China. They have the flag of the Republic of China, and that's what's on their passports. The United States gets involved in protecting Taiwan after the beginning of the Korean War. We sail the U.S. fleet in between, and then from that point on, it's been a point of contention between the United States and China. Now, up until 1972, we didn't even recognize the Chinese Communist government, actually up until 1979. And then when Nixon went in 72, he said, Taiwan belongs to China. And you can say that. And Carter agreed in 1979 when he normalized relations. So if you want to talk about what the official position of the United States government is, from a historical point of view, that's the US government's position. And when they say one China policy, that's what they mean. You have the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China, and there can only be one. And we recognize the People's Republic of China. And that leaves kind of Taiwan sort of in no man's land in international law and international relations, which is really unfair and unjust to the people who live there. I think it's a mistake to compare what's happening in Taiwan with Ukraine, which is another part of your question. The biggest mistake the United States made at the beginning of the last Cold War was the way we connected what was happening in Europe to what was happening in Asia. We imagined that the Soviet Union and China were operating as a bloc, that one controlled the other. That's why we didn't recognize the communist government in China. None of that was true. And it led to a lot of mistakes. They weren't operating in concert. For example, the Korean War, the formative event of the Cold War in Asia. Mao Zedong did not want Kim Il-sung to invade the South. And Stalin said he agreed until he secretly made an agreement with Kim to let him intervene. And then when the United States responded, China had to make its own decision about protecting itself, whether it was going to intervene. And had we had some basic conversation, channel of conversation with the Chinese Communist government, we would have known these things. And we could very well have avoided the Korean War and very well have avoided the Vietnam War. So it's a mistake to associate Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan. They're two very separate and very distinct problems. And we need to think about them and how to resolve them in very, very distinct ways.
To go off that a bit, the past administration, the last administration talked about arms control in a way where they didn't want to do with just Russia. They wanted to bring China in a sort of trilateral agreement of some kind. What are your thoughts on that strategy? Do you think the U.S. should pursue its own arms treaties with just China? I know that we're down to just the New START treaty with Russia, but what do you think of the thought of trying to do a trilateral treaty, or should there be its own between the U.S. and China?
So China's official position is that, the arsenals of the US and Russia are so much larger that when they get down to where China is, maybe. But even then, I think China does not like to negotiate outside of the United Nations. They want to negotiate these arms agreements inside the United Nations Conference on Disarmament. They want all the nations of the world to be represented and involved in those negotiations. They don't want it to be this big power decision-making where the other nations of the world are not involved. So they're uncomfortable with the idea of trilateral negotiations. I think in order to get things started, there's some very simple steps, except politically inside of the United States, where they're not so simple. The first thing is to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. That was the first treaty that China played a role in negotiating, and we didn't ratify it. So that was a big blow to Chinese confidence in the efficacy of international arms control. The second thing we need to do is to resume negotiations on a treaty to control the fissile materials, a fissile material control treaty. If you stop testing verifiably, and you have verifiable controls on the production of fissile material, that puts a cap, a verifiable cap on the size of China's nuclear arsenal. They're the first two things any common sense approach to arms control with China that we should do. If we were to take those two steps, I think you would see a pretty dramatic change in Chinese attitudes towards talking to the United States about nuclear arms control negotiations. But until we take those two steps, I think there's very little confidence in the Chinese government that the United States is serious about nuclear arms control, and it just wants to use these meetings to embarrass them diplomatically.
Someone asked, and maybe you just answered it, Gregory, but somebody asked, what specifically should we be trying to get our elected officials to do? Are there some trade proposals or other types of agreements? What can the people on this call, when they're talking and they're urging their Congress members, what would you suggest that they are urging them to pursue?
Well, on the nuclear issue, it's the CTBT, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Get the Senate to ratify that. As well as getting the administration to re-engage in the Conference on Disarmament in the UN on negotiations of a treaty on the fissile material control. I mean, they are going to make the United States safer. If you're worried about the increase in the size of nuclear arsenal, that's a way to put a limit on it. It's a way to cap it. So it really doesn't make any sense for us to be not making progress on those two things. On trade and other issues, this is not something that the Global Security Program works on, but I think it's important to realize that we had the global trading rules we had because they keep the peace. The origins of the global trading system that we developed over 40 some years at the end of World War II were designed to prevent violent conflicts between nations. The outbreak of a Third World War, because economic competition leads to military conflict, and they wanted to break that link. And it's just very unfortunate that the trade system was corporatized and that it benefited a very small number of large corporations and hurt a lot of other businesses and employers and unions. And the way it was implemented was far from ideal, and it definitely needed to be changed. But to just dismantle it and completely ignore it, the way the previous administration did an enormous amount of damage to everyone's confidence in the future of their. China has 1.4 billion mouths to feed, to people to house, people to take care of, and they are extremely anxious about their ability to do that. So economic competition has very serious consequences for the Chinese, and you can't separate trade and security so neatly.
Thanks. Most everyone on this call knows that Union of Concerned Scientists works on climate change issue as well. We had a lot of climate questions come in for you, Gregory. So I chose this one from someone that submitted it ahead of time. What are the best initiatives that can be taken to encourage U.S. China cooperation in addressing climate change?
Well, there has to be some sort of basic trust that there isn't some sort of diplomatic one-upsmanship going on here. This is why things broke down at the climate conference in Copenhagen in 2009. If you believe the Chinese version of the story, which people who were at the meeting related to me, the US assumed that China was talking to the BRICS nations, India, Russia, South Africa, Brazil, to undermine the agreement. But the Chinese claimed that they were actually trying to bring the other four on board. And that's what they were doing in that meeting. And then President Obama sort of crashes the meeting. This was a huge diplomatic embarrassment for the Chinese government, which I don't think that they've gotten over yet. And they saw it as an act of bad faith. I don't know if that's true. I'm just relating their version of the story. The American version of the story is that they were actually trying to subvert the goals of the conference, and then Obama stepped in at the last minute to sort of save the day. I wasn't there, and I can't make a judgment about that. But unless there's trust, this security issue and the climate issue are tied in this way. Without trust and without dialogue, it's hard to make progress on any issue, especially one where countries have to make sacrifices, serious economic sacrifices, in order to cut their carbon emissions. And we need China, especially, to cut its coal emissions. And as much progress as that they're making, it's not enough. And they're going to have to make some sacrifices, and they're going to have to be convinced that those sacrifices are going to be appreciated and reciprocated. And given the level of distrust between the two governments now, that's just not happening.
One thing I loved about questions that came in for you, Gregory, was the people really want to be involved and do what they can within their sphere of influence. One question I chose around those lines that came in ahead of time was, do you believe that non-official communications between the Chinese and Americans will help the two nations stay connected? And will this type of civic dialogue help ease tensions?
Well, this is the point of my talk. Yes, we have power to change the nature of the relationship. It absolutely makes a difference. The entire conversation about China changes when constituents talk about their experience with this group in China, or their connections with this group in China, or their understanding of this problem in China from their own personal experience. And the more of those you have, the greater your ability to push the conversation in a different direction. So every individual interaction matters, and they add up. They have a cumulative effect on the relationships. We saw this in the 70s and the 80s, and there's no reason that something like that can't be repeated. So yes, non-governmental exchanges can make a tremendous difference on the formal relationship between the two governments.
Thank you so much. I have one more for you, Gregory. I don't know if you're gonna like the premise of this question, but I think it's a good one to kick off. It came into the chat. If you were U.S. president, what would you do to get a better relationship with China?
Well, that ain't going to happen, and I would not serve. What was that line that Lyndon Johnson said? Dialogue. It's just a matter of dialogue. President Biden gave a very nice couple of paragraphs on U.S.-China relations today at the United Nations. I encourage you all to take a look at them if you haven't seen them. They were very constructive comments. And if he could just get the Chinese to believe that he's telling the truth, I think there would be a lot of progress that was possible. But he's going to have to do this consistently, and he's going to have to back up the words with actions. And unfortunately, the United States is taking steps to, protect our economy and to compete technologically, and the Chinese are interpreting those steps as a form of economic warfare. Plus, we're doing all these, war games and constantly talking about the, war-like scenarios with the Chinese. We fly planes and ships up and down their coast all the time. There's constant encounters between the Chinese military and the U.S. military in the waters surrounding China's periphery. Unless we do something to manage those things better, it's very difficult for words to change the relationship. So and then the other problem is the Chinese are not at all confident that President Biden will get reelected, and that his successor will feel the same way. So this has to be bipartisan, and it has to be communicated by both parties in order for it to have a demonstrable influence on the way things are going. And I know that's very difficult, but that has to happen. And if I were in a position where I could influence that as a president, I would make that a priority.
Well, that's much appreciated, and that takes us to 56 past the hour. So I think that'll probably do it for Q&A. Thank you so much to everyone that submitted a question. Gregory has a blog. I'm going to share it in the chat. It's on all things nuclear through Union of Concerned Scientists. Lots of thanks coming into the chat. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to post, or David, if you can post the link to the action. Be on the lookout for Monday. We're going to send a follow-up email with the recording to everyone that RSVP'd, another chance to take action, and a link to Gregory's blog. Gregory, thank you so much. I know I learned so much tonight, and I hope everyone that attended too. Also, Joanna, thank you so much for being here and for kicking us off. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight, and be on the lookout for that follow-up email. Any closing words, Gregory?
Just take care, everybody, and do the best you can.
Thanks all.